Today's shiur begins at the top line of Daf Mem Beis. The Gemara opens with a quote from a Tanaic source that we saw back on Daf Mem Omid Aleph, 16 rows from the top. The source there dealt with Leviim, Nazirim, and Mitzrayim as requiring tiglachas, requiring the haircut. And the source said, and we read in our Gemara, Omar Mar, a quote from there, V'chulam shegilchu shelo betar, all of them, the three categories we mentioned, if they took their haircuts without a razor, o sheshayru shtei cyrus lo osu v'lo klum, or they shave their entire heads but leaving two hairs uncut, they have done nothing. Based on this source, the Gemara wants to conclude a general concept, and on the side of the Gemara we have a topic heading which says Rubo Kikulo Midoraisa, that Rov, the majority of things in general, wherever you have an issue of a doubt or a conflict and you need to resolve it, you can base your resolution on the majority. That concept is that rubo, that the majority, kikulo, is considered like the entire mass, midoraisa. That's a Torah level idea. The Gemara, Omar Rav Acha Brei Durav Iko Zoisai Meres. From this Tanaic source, we conclude rubo kikulo midoraisa, that where you have rov, where you have a majority, that is considered like the whole thing, and that is a Torah-based idea. Mimai, well, how do you see that from this? Answer, Bidagoli Rachmona Gabi Nazir. From the fact that the Torah reveals to us, with regard to the Nazir, it says, Bayom Hashvi'i Yigalchenu. And on the seventh day of his Nazirus, that he happened to experience a state of Tumah, he shall shave his head. And we say that Hocha, who da'adi kokulo, here by Nazir, we require all the hair to be shaved. Ha be'almo, but in other cases, rubo kekulo. Before going further, let's glance at the Tosfos on the top line, the top Tosfos. Omar Mar, oy sheshayu shtei cyrus lo osuf lo klum, zo someres de rubo kekulo doraisa. Midagoli rachmona gabi Nazir bayom hashvi galchenu. From the revelation of the Torah that the Nazir shall take his haircut on the seventh day of purification, Delo itzrich, that teaching that he needs to shave his head isn't really necessary. The Farksiv, the Gilach. There's another pasuk that says he shall shave his head. So why is this idea repeated here? Elashmeinin, it's here to inform us. De bo'inon tiglachas mitzvah shlema shelo shayra klum, that here a total hair shave is required, where he leaves nothing behind. Here, the Torah went out of its way to tell me that you have to literally remove all the hair. But in general, we would conclude that the majority is as if you did everything. We turn back to the Gemara. Maskif law Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Yossi asks, regarding the source that was just cited, the scriptural source, B'yom hashvi'i galchenu, Hi, benazir tomei ksiv. This pasuk appears in the context of a nazir who became defiled, whereas the Tanaic source that we quoted at the top, back from Daf Mem Amud Aleph, that Tanaic source implied that a nazir tohor as well. We are saying rubo kekulo machaku alo b'marova. Here we have a response. It takes a few lines to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina's question. Now, Mochla Barava literally means they jeered what he had asked in Eretz Yisrael. But it's a reference to a particular opinion that says in response, there is no basis for making a distinction between Nazir Tomei and Nazir Tohor. Michti, Nazir Tomei de Betar Minolan. Where do we know that a Nazir who had become defiled and needs to take her haircut after 7 days of purification, that the haircut must be done with a razor. Where is that information learned from? Nazir Torah Yolef. It's derived from the rules that pertain to Nazir Torah. Leisi Nazir Torah, v'leilif Nazir Tomei. Now, let us go in the other direction and derive laws concerning the Nazir Torah from the laws that pertain to Nazir Tomei. Ma Tomei ki shiur shtei sayros v'lo klum ovad. Just like by a Nazir Tomei, after his haircut, if 2 hairs remain uncut, he hasn't accomplished anything. Hochanami, so too here, with regard to the Nazir Torah, ki shiur shtei sayros v'lo klum ovad. If he leaves 2 hairs behind, he hasn't done anything. So as we said before, in the context of the Nazir, literally everything must be removed. All the hair must be removed. However, in general, rubo kikulo. On the side we have a nosei, topic heading / mivneh, structural note, with a triangle featured. And we've written Shtei She'elos Binyan Nazir Shigilach Ve'ishir Shtei Sayros. 2 questions that deal with a Nazir who took the haircut but left behind uncut 2 hairs. We continue in the Gemara. Boy Abaye Nazir Shigilach Ve'shir Shtei Sayros. Abaye asks, a Nazir that took his haircut but left 2 hairs. Tzomach Rosho. The 2 hairs remained on his head while the rest of his hair grew back. V'chozar v'gilchon mahu. And then, after having marked, so to speak, those 2 hairs, identifying those 2 original uncut hairs, he then cut them. When in the meantime, the rest of his head of hair had grown back. What is the din? Mi ma'akvi o lo. Do we say that since when he took the original required Nazir haircut, he left those 2 hairs, they remain a binding restrictive feature, and his cutting of them right now isn't going to help, because at this point the rest of his hair has grown back? Or do we say that, well, right now he's cutting them and that is sufficient, and the fact that the rest of his hair grew back, that is not a restrictive factor? The Gemara doesn't answer that. It goes on with another question. Boy Rava. Nazir shegilach v'hiniach shtei sayros. You'll notice that we have a number 1 because this question really appears in 2 stages. The first stage is rejected as being a question. A couple lines later you see we squiggle under an elo emo. That represents the restatement of what the question ought to be. So in the meantime, Rava is asking about a Nazir that took his haircut, left 2 hairs, v'gilach achas, and then he came to cut those last 2 hairs. He cut one v'noshra achas, and the second one fell off. So he didn't do a cutting of the last 2 hairs. He cut one, but the other one, the last one, fell out. Mahu. Omar le Rav Acha midifti l'Ravina. Rav Acha says to Ravina regarding this question, Gilach Sairo Komiboya Leila Rava. Is Rava asking about someone who's cutting his hairs individually one by one? The Rashi explains further. Let's read the Rashi together. Gilach Sairo Komiboya Leila Rava Pshita the Kevan the Gilach as Kol Rosho Labarme Hanoch Shtei Saris. It's clear to us that once he's cut the rest of the hair, all his hair off, with the exception of these last 2 hairs, the chihadar gilach achas mehen v'noshra chaverta, when he then goes to cut the last 2, he cuts one and the other one falls out. Shapir, it's fine. The ka'ozil umiglach ki urche. He is, in effect, approaching his haircut in a normal way. The command to ozil megalech sairo. It's no different than someone who would be cutting hair one by one. He intended to cut each one, those 2 last hairs. He cut one, the last one then fell out. What could he possibly do about it? So we go back to the Gemara, being that the scenario number 1 doesn't appear to be something that needs to be asked. It's clear that he's Yotze, that he's fulfilled his Nazir requirements, his Nazir haircut requirements in that fashion. Elo Emal. The Gemara continues, number 2. Noshro achas v'gilach achas mahu. He cut the hair off his head, left 2 hairs, and then when he's about to return to cut those last 2 hairs off, 1 hair falls out before he cuts any of them, of those last 2. 1 falls out, and he cuts the last 1 hair. Omar lay. So he answers, Seyar ein kan, Giluach ein kan. There is no hair over here, and there's no haircut over here. We ask, Isayar ein kan, if you're saying there's no hair over here, in other words, that the haircut is considered accomplished, so then Giluach yesh kan, then there's a fulfillment of the Giluach, the haircut requirement. So how can you say both Sayar ein kan and Giluach ein kan? That would be almost contradictory. Hachi Komar. So the Gemara answers, even though, technically speaking, there is no more mitzvah of Giluach. In other words, the hair requirement has been fulfilled. Ein kan mitzvahs. Let me read that again. Afal pisha seir ein kan mitzvahs Giluach ein kan. You nevertheless do not have the fulfillment of the mitzvah in its fullest form. To appreciate this response, we glance together at the Rosh commentary on the lower part of the page. We have a little star in the Rosh to make it easier to find. Hachi Kamar, Afal pisha seir ein kan mitzvahs Giluach ein kan. Hayol ubetiglachas orishon, since at the initial haircut, shiur shtei cyrus, he left behind 2 hairs. And with that, you don't fulfill the original haircut requirement. And now when he comes to complete the haircut, he doesn't see 2 hairs left. He sees only 1 hair left. Lo kiyem mitzvahs giluach. He didn't fulfill the mitzvah of giluach in the fullest sense. We continue in the Gemara, but before we continue with the Mishnah, let's just mention regarding that last point that, as we've said till now, cutting all the hair and leaving 2 hairs behind, it's as if no haircut took place. So you see that in order to accomplish the mitzvah of a proper haircut, he would have to cut off the 2 hairs. Being that when he came to cut off those 2 last hairs, 1 fell out, so he wasn't doing a full-fledged mitzvah of haircutting. Haircutting would mean you have to cut off the last 2 hairs. Well, that didn't take place because the first of the last 2 fell out. You ended up cutting the last hair. So as we saw, there's really nothing you can do about it, but to say that you fulfilled the mitzvah of haircut in the fullest sense, that cannot be said. Before we begin the Mishnah, we glance at the side. We have a topic heading, Moni Masnis, and the Gemara will be asking concerning this Mishnah. It's a very brief quote of a brief Mishnah that's quoted here, only 1 line. The Gemara will ask, who is the author Shemechalekes bein choifef umefasfei shemutorin l'srika shasura? The Tana that makes a distinction between these 2 motions or 2 actions done to the hair, choifef umefasfeis, that's okay, but srika is generally understood to be something like combing, that would be forbidden. So the Mishnah says, Nazir choifef u mefasfeis, avoloi sorek. The Rashi says on the lower part of the page, Nazir choifef u mefasfeis, choifef kmo chofef olov ko hayom, loshon megared. It has to do with scratching one's head. And mefasfeis, Rashi explains, shemafrid saroisiv zumizu, a separation of individual hairs one from the other. Avalo b'masrik, but not a separation using a comb. So our Mishnah says that scratching one's head or separating hairs by hand would be okay, but combing would not be allowed. The Gemara, chofef umefasfeis, moni, Who would say that there is allowance of chofev mafasves? Rabbi Shimon, this would be in accordance with Rabbi Shimon. The Omar Dover Shein Miskave Mutter. Rabbi Shimon has a principle that we see applied here, and you see it in Masechah, with regard to Hilchos Shabbos, and you find it in many other locations as well. That, let's say, forbidden outcomes that occurred as a result of an action, but the action was without the intention of producing that forbidden outcome, the person is said to have violated nothing. Nothing wrong was done. That's Dover Shein Miskavin, something that you did not have intent for, mutter, is allowed. So a Nazir would be allowed to chofef, to scratch his head or separate hairs. He has no intention of having the hair itself dislodged. The Mishnah goes on to say avolo sorek, but he cannot do sorek. Well, asan the Rabbanan. If you're combing your hair, you're combing because you're interested in separating hairs. You're not interested in uprooting the hairs. And yet the Mishnah prohibits that. Even though it's a dover she'ein miskavein, you had no intention for the forbidden outcome of hair removal, still the Mishnah restricts it. So that doesn't come out like Reb Shimon, that comes out like those that argue with him, like the Rabbanon. So what kind of Mishnah structure we have, even though it's a very short Mishnah, it's split. Reisha, Reb Shimon, Sefer Rabbanon. Should we say that the Reisha conforms to Reb Shimon? The Sefer does not. It works out like the Rabbanon. Omar Rabba Kula Reb Shimon He. This entire Mishnah is in accordance with Reb Shimon. You'll ask then, what about the restriction of Sorek? So the Gemara explains, cause Sorek, anyone who puts a comb to their hair, lahasir nimen miduldolos miskavin. His intention is actually to remove the nimen hairs miduldolos that are loosely attached. In other words, to remove loosely attached hairs. And we dashed on the word miskavin, indicating this is something even Rav Shimon would find to be prohibited. In our previous Mishnah, we saw the word chofef. The Mishnah that we're about to learn, you'll see Rabbi Shmuel mentioning not to be chofef, lo yachuf. On the side of our Gemara, under the nosei, the topic heading, we've written ein lachfoif ba'adoma b'pnei shemasheres es haseyor. Lachfof, Tosfos points out, quotes a foreign word, and he says shiochuf b'roshoi b'neser v'adoma. This would have to be a process that's probably similar to what we would call rinsing out one's hair, shampooing. The material that one used then, the substance that one used, is either neser, a type of mineral, or adoma. Adoma is translated often as dirt, earth. So our Mishnah has Rabbi Shmuel teaching not to be chofef using adoma. Why? Because it's masheres as a seir, it causes the hairs to fall out, to be dislodged, to be removed. The Mishnah, Rabbi Shmuel, Omer lo yochuf ba'adoma v'nei she'masheres es haseir. The Gemara asks a question. You'll notice it's a long question with two parts. Ibaya laho, two sides of the question. Mipnei shehi masheres es haseir tanan, is the Mishnah to be understood as an explanation as to why dirt is prohibited, and it is because the dirt, causes the hair to fall out. While rinsing it or shampooing it, it will fall out. O dilma mipnei hamasheres tanan. Or is the Mishnah saying not to use dirt, not because dirt itself causes the hair to fall out, but if you use dirt, then you might come to use another substance, a substance that does cause the hair to fall out. The Gemara asks, Lamai nafkamina, what difference does it make? Either way you look at things, you can't use dirt. Kagon di'iko adoma dolo masra. The point of difference would be, in this analysis, if you have a substance, a material that does not cause any hair to fall out. I amris mipnei shehi masheres tanan. If the analysis is the first way. Namely, Rabbi Shmuel says do not use dirt because it causes hair to fall out. So, Hechod Yadino Delo Masra Shapir, where you know that it doesn't cause falling out. Masra is the same as Masheres, the Tuf and the Shin interchange. So, if the first approach is the way to go, then where you know that the substance does not cause hair to fall out, it would be okay. Eloi Amris Mipnei Hamasheres, if the prohibition against using dirt is a gzeira, because using any kind of dirt might be confused with the kind that does cause hair to fall out, then klal lo, then all types of adoma would be prohibited, even the kind that doesn't cause the hair to fall out. Teku. So this remains unresolved. The result of this would be that if you take a stringent approach, then you would be prohibited in even using the kind of dirt that does not cause hair to fall out. As we continue with the next Mishnah, you notice a diamond appears, and on the side under the Mivneh heading, we've indicated Pu'ulos Asuros LeNazir, different actions that are prohibited upon a Nazir. Just the bird's eye view of what we're going to see, you'll see reference made to his drinking of wine, shaving the hair on his head, and exposure to defilement. The Mishnah, Nazir shohaya shoyse yayin kol hayom, eino chayav elo achas. A Nazir that was warned at the beginning of the day, don't drink wine, and he spends the rest of the day drinking. He might consume many bottles of wine. He's only going to be liable to one punishment, one set of lashes. Omru lo al tishte, v'hu shoseh. He's warned numerous times, do not drink, and each time after the warning, he drinks. So you have a situation of warning, drinks. The Mishnah tells us, chayav al kol achas v'achas, he's going to be liable for each drinking. Hoya megaleach kol hayom, eino chayav elo achas. If he was warned at the beginning of the day, and he starts cutting hairs, and we know that a Nazir is chayav for cutting each hair carries with it a potential penalty, but he received only one warning, so the rest of the day that he spends cutting theirs will result only in one punishment. Omrulo al tigaleach vu megaleach. He's warned numerous times, and following each warning, he cuts another hair. Chayav al kol achas v'achas. He'll be held responsible and liable to punishment for each one. Hoyemetami l'meisim kol hayoim einu chayav elo achas. He defiled himself to the dead all day. He's going to be responsible or guilty of only one punishment. Omrlo al tetame vumetame chayav al kol achas v'achas. We continue at the top of Omid Beis. The topic that we'll be seeing now is explained or introduced on the side under our Nosei/Mivneh heading. A double underline appears. This highlights the Machlokas Rabbah and Rav Yosef Be'inyan, and we should say that Rabbah and Rav Yosef both are trying to represent Rav Huna's opinion. So you have two versions of Rav Huna, and they have a disagreement. Be'inyan Kefel Tumos Benazir, multiple Tuma as it applies to a Nazir. Could go noga b'meis v'nichnas lo'oyal ha'meis. Let us imagine he touched a corpse and then went into a room. It went into an overshadow where he and a corpse were both located. That is a case of, we'll say, kefel tumos, repeat tumos. We noted that there's a machlokis Rashi and Tosfos b'havonas sugya. Not unusual for our Masechta, a disagreement or discrepancy arises between Rashi and Tosfos and how to present the Gemara. The Gemara. Itmar, Omar Rabba, Omar Rav Huna. Mikra mole diber hakasuv. Lo yitama. Ukshu oimer lo yovo. Laziro al hatuma. Laziro al habia. Avol tuma v'tuma lo. We look at the Rashi at the top. Mikra mole diber hakasuv ben Nazir. Means a pasuk appears explicitly in Nazir. Bamidbar Perek Vav Pasuk Zayin Lo Yitama Lehem B'Moisam L'Hasiro Ala Tuma, to warn Nazirim not to become defiled to the dead. Ukshechozav Yomar Kol Yimei Haziro Lashem Al Nefesh Meis Lo Yavo. That's it. Pasuk Vav. Chozar V'Ziro Al Bias Oyhel Shabo Meis. The prohibition of entering a room in which there is a corpse. Lo marloch. We'll say the double warning that you see here tells me she'im nitma b'meis v'chozer v'nichnas b'oil sheyesh bo meis chayev shtayim, that if he defiled himself by touching a corpse outdoors, no overhang, no overshadowing over him and the corpse, just he happened to touch a corpse, and then went into an oyel. An oyel, we can use the example of a room just for convention, but it includes cases of a common overshadow. And then he went into an oyel in which there was a corpse, chayev shtayim. He's thereby violated the two prohibitions. Rashi goes on, Avol tuma v'tuma, avol im nitma b'meis, v'chozer v'noga b'meis acher, ba'oid shu nogea b'meis rishon, afal pi shehisru bo, eino chayav elo achas, do metame v'koi. But, if he, let us say, touched a corpse, and while he's touching the first corpse, he then touches a second corpse, he will not be considered an offender of a second offense. As Rashi said, he's already metame v'koi, he's already in the middle of his original tuma by touching the first body. As we mentioned before, Tosfos explains this in a different fashion, but for the time being, we will continue with the Rashi. Rav Yosef Omar. Rav Yosef reacts to Rabba's presentation of Rav Huna. Note that this lasts a number of lines. We have a long marking. Rav Yosef says, Ho'elakim, it's an expression, a type of, let's say, oath. Omar Rav Huna afilu tuma v'tuma. Rav Huna says there is a double violation for the case of being metame, touching a corpse, and then touching a second corpse. The Omar Rav Huna, Nazir shoya oimed beveis hakvoros, v'hoshitu lo meiso umeis acher. A Nazir who was standing in a cemetery, and standing in a cemetery is understood to be an example of an individual who defiled himself to the dead. So you have someone that defiled himself to the dead, and they handed him either a dead relative of the Nazir, meso is his own mace, meaning a dead relative of his, or some stranger that was deceased, v'noga bo, and touched that corpse, chayav. Amai, why is he chayav? Ha metame v'koyim. Well, he's already tomei by having been in the cemetery. Elolav shma minom Rav Huna. From here we see that Rav Huna holds afilu tuma v'tuma, for having defiled himself a second time while being defiled already, he is considered guilty. Esvei Abaye. So Abaye asks on Rav Yosef from a Tanaic source, Kohen shohoya lo meis munoch al ksefo, a Kohen who, by the way, is also like a Nazir, prohibited against defilement to the dead. A standard Kohen has a less restrictive prohibition, but both fall into the category of being warned against defilement to the dead. Kohen shohaya lo meis munach al ksefo. A Kohen that had a body slung over his shoulder. V'hoshitu lo meso umeis acher. And they handed to the Kohen a dead relative or another deceased individual. V'noga bo, and touched this second dead body. Yochol yehei chayev, will he be considered guilty for that second touching? Talmud lomar v'lo yechalel. The Torah warns against his defiling, profaning his priesthood. And we learn from this, when is there a violation? B'mi she'eno mechulol, when one is pure and then initially defiles himself. Yotzazeh, to the exclusion of this scenario, shu mechulol ve'omed, he's already defiled. So when he's already defiled, the second defilement is of no concern. Well, that would be against Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef claims that Rav Huna holds that a Nazir who was already defiled by being in the cemetery and was handed a corpse, that second action of defilement does create guilt. Omar lei. So Rav Yosef says back to Abaye, V'tikshi loch masnisen. Well, doesn't the Mishnah pose a difficulty to you? Disnan. The Mishnah says, Hoya metame lemesim kol hayomenu chayav elo achas. Omru lo al titame chayav al kol achas v'achas. Here you see from the last part of this quote where we dashed underline, we see multiple violations. So that each time he touches another corpse, he should be held guilty. And that's against what you, Abaye, are trying to argue. Ve'amai, why, according to you, is he chayav for each corpse? Ha'metame v'koyim, is he not already defiled? Well then, elokashi agodi. Well, now we have a seeming contradiction between two sources. The source that Abaye quoted indicates that the Kohen, once he's defiled, his second contact does not result in any further liability, whereas our Mishnah would seem to say to the contrary. Loi kashya. Really, there is no contradiction. Kan bechiburin, kan shelo bechiburin. According to Rashi, the case of chiburin literally means attached. That when we saw in the source that Abaye quoted, the Kohen had the corpse, a corpse slung over his shoulder. While the corpse was on his shoulder, he touched a second mace. So the touching of the second mace does not increase any liability because he's already attached to a source of defilement, of death defilement. So, in a case like that, it's only viewed as an extension of the original defilement. However, our Mishnah, the second source quoted, that says chayv al kol achas v'achas, that's a case shelo b'chiburin, meaning he touched one body, then detached himself from that body, and then touched a second body, and detached himself from that, and so on and so forth. That would result in multiple violations. So the case of chiburin, for our purposes, can be described as one extended tumah, a singular extended tumah. The Gemara asks, the tumah b'chiburin d'oraisa? Is this concept of attachment to tumah a Torah concept? Torah meaning Torah versus, let's say, rabbinic stringency. Is this a Torah level concern? Omar Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, Omar Rav Yanai, lo omru tuma b'chiburin elo letruma v'kochim, avol lenazir v'oisa pesach lo. 4 different areas of halacha were just mentioned: truma, kochim, nazir, and oisa pesach. And the distinction is made, the concept of Tumah B'chiburin would have relevance only for Truma consumption and sacrificial detail, but with regard to a Nazir and someone who is doing a Korban Pesach, someone who is about to do a Korban Pesach, the Chiburin concern would fall away. We haven't explained this yet, but just to conclude the question, the Amris Doraisa Maishna, if Chiburin is considered one long Tumah, why should any distinction be made? In order to appreciate the question, we'll learn together the Rashi. On the second line under the Gemara text, the Tumah B'chiburin, mi havyula doraisa kechada Tumah, is it on a Torah level considered like one extended Tumah? The mishum da'avi mechuber adayin b'meis rishon ko amres la dechi hodar noga b'meis zeh havyula lekula chada Tumah midiraisa. Since when he touched the second body, he was still attached to the first body, he's not considered liable for a second offense because it's just one long Tumah. Is that a Torah level concept? Continuing in the Rashi, V'ha'amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef lo amru Tumah b'chiburin im adam nogea yado b'meis. If a person touches a corpse, the oiches bo, and he clings upon the corpse, the yado acheres nesuna biad chavero, and his other hand is clasped within the hand of his friend, his living friend. Lo amris she'egam oisa chavero kamishu mechuber v'nagea b'tumazu. We don't say that the friend is considered attached to the corpse. Elolinin kochim u'truma. Only with regard to sacrifices and truma, the tithe given to kohanim. She'eno yochol lechol bohen ad shiva. That if the friend happened to be a Kohen and he wanted to partake of truma or sacrifices, he would have to wait 7 days. Namely, we would be viewing the friend who's not directly attached to the corpse, but through this connection to someone that is touching the corpse simultaneously, we would view the friend as being Tomei for 7 days, which is synonymous with himself having, as if he himself touched the corpse. Avol le'inyan Nazir listor naziruso lahavi korban al tuma. But if that friend was a Nazir, and the question would arise, does he lose the Nazirus days that he counted? Would he then have to bring sacrifices for his having defiled himself to the dead? Or loisa pesach shelasoso b'shvil shu tomei. Or if it was the 14th of Nisan and he had to do a Korban Pesach, would we say that he is now restricted from doing a Korban Pesach? Like would be the case, anyone who became defiled to the dead, directly to the dead, within a week before Pesach, so that when the 14th of Nisan, which is the date for doing the Pesach, you would still be within your 7-day Tumah period, would this person be restricted from doing the Korban Pesach? Lo amru shtei Tumah b'chiburin. With regard to the Nazir and the Yosef Pesach, we don't view the friend as if he's attached. The Rashi goes on, V'amris demidoraisa havi choshuv tumas chiburin ketuma richta. If you are going to say that while being attached to Tumah, any further attachment is considered just like one long extension of the Tumah, then Rashi goes on, Maishno Nazir v'Yosef Pesach mikotchem u'truma. Why should there be any distinction? We turn back to the Gemara, and I dare say that many of you might have already guessed the answer before going on in the Gemara. Kan b'chiburei adam b'adam, kan b'chiburei adam b'meis. If you're dealing with one that we said before, a friend that grabbed the hand of someone who was touching a corpse. That's the case of chiburei adam b'adam, where someone is attaching himself to a person who in turn is touching a body. That is we'll say tuma b'chiburin, in which we make a distinction between Truma Kachim versus Pesach and the Nazir. However, the case of Chiburei Oda B'meis, there we say that it's considered one long Tuma, whereby a person touched a corpse or had a corpse slung over his shoulder, and then he touches another corpse. That second corpse does not engender a second liability because of the concept of Tuma Richta, one long Tuma. The case of a person connected to a person who is touching a mace, the idea of one long Tuma extending to the second party, that is limited. It's not the same thing as the case of Chiburei Odam b'meis, one person touching, we'll say simultaneously, two bodies. We continue with further analysis of what we've learned till now. Avol Tuma v'Tuma lo. We said above, we have a little arrow to help you navigate. And you see way above, when Rabbah initially presented his version of Rav Huna, he presented it with a distinction between a case of Tuma v'Tuma versus Tuma Ubiyah. Whereas in the case of Tuma v'Tuma, he had been touching corpse number one, and while touching corpse number one, he came into contact with corpse number two. There we said that the second corpse does not generate an additional liability. But however, with regard to Tuma Ubiyah, Rav Huna, according to Rabbah, said the subsequent entrance after having touched the corpse, that does generate a second Tuma. So now the Gemara questions this distinction. Why does the second corpse not engender a second liability? It's because he's already Tomei, he's already in contact with the first body. But the point is, he's already Tomei. Well, Tumo Bionami Hometame V'koi, in the case of someone that had contacted a mace, and then went into a room where there was a second body, before he entered that room, he was already Tomei. Why then do you say that he is Chayav, he is guilty of entering a room with a body in it? Omar Rav Yochanan, Kan bebayis, kan besodeh. We look at Rashi in order to really appreciate this answer. Kan bebayis, kan besodeh. Ki amrinon anan dechayev al habiyah v'alatuma. When it was said, when we said the opinion that Rabbah presented above, that there would be two violations. Ki amrinanan dechayev al habiyah v'al hatuma, that he's chayav for both the entrance into the room and for the initial touching. Kagon denichnas bebayis shameis l'soichoi. That is a case where a person who had not been defiled walked into a room in which there was a corpse. The tuma ubiyah bahadi hadodi asyon. This already is a new approach to what we have said before. So that Rabbi Yochanan is acknowledging the concept of a double liability. That's a case where the two problems arose at once, bahadi hadodi. Namely, the entrance to a room in which there's a corpse, so there's the guilt of entering a room with a corpse, and also there's guilt for incurring defilement. The other case, which is represented in the Tanaic source that Abaye had brought into this discussion, which says, to the exclusion of someone who was already defiled, that a second defilement does not impose an additional liability. That's a case where he touched a body outdoors, and then he went into a room, finding himself under the same overshadow, the ceiling, under the same ceiling as a corpse, the potter. There he would be exempt. And I would like to suggest that this explanation is presenting, as we said, only one offense, but it's describing the very way we described the original Rabbah, quoting Rav Huna, in saying that there would be two offenses. So, Rabbi Yochanan is telling us as follows. There's a concept of a double violation, but that's only if the two problems set in simultaneously. So we can't choose one over the other, so he's guilty for both. However, where they are in succession, where one had already become tomei by virtue of having touched a body outdoors, and then walked into a room where there was a body, he's mechul v'omer, he's already been defiled, so he's not guilty for the second defilement. The Gemara, though, asks, Bebayis nami, even the case of entering a room where there's a corpse. We're at the top of Daf Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. Is it really so that entering a room in which there's a corpse, a person that had not been defiled before, and enters the room, the two offenses happen simultaneously, namely entrance, lo yovo, and defilement? Is it really simultaneous? So the Gemara again, at the top of Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. Bebayis nami, kefen d'ayul yodei istoyev. When people walk, they have a tendency to swing their hands. So that as a person is entering the room, technically speaking, his hand enters first, and that imparts tumah. Ki ayol kulei, when he fully enters, hi tomehu, he's entering as an individual's already been defiled. So that the hand going into the room, that's not called entrance. Your whole body has to enter in order to be called entering. But when your hand entered the room before your entire body, at that point you absorb tumah. So that what then do we see? That the two offenses of defilement and entrance are not really simultaneous. Well, what we have here is a triangle, you can see, series of answers, and on the side, nosei, hemshech, a continuation of the topic, and the mivneh, the structure. These triangles are hesberim, eicha nichlis lebayis, nitmos shtei atumos, lo yitame v'lo yovel b'vas achas. How could it be that entrance to a room in which there is a corpse, that in fact the two violations appear simultaneously? So Rabbi Ozer suggests, Rabbi Ozer should tziref yodo mishum tuma iko mishum bia leka v'tziref gufo tuma ubia behadi hadodi ka'asu. Rashi on the third line from the top, Elom Rabbi Ozer, Tziref Yodo, Kol Hecha de Hoishit Yodo Likones Tchila. Tziref in this context then would mean wherever the hand was extended to enter first. So then Rashi goes on, Mishum Tuma Ika, Mishum Bio Leka. There is defilement, but there is not yet entrance. And it's not as if the two are happening simultaneously. The case that Rabbi Yochanan featured is what? The tzirif gufo. Klomar, sheichnis kol gufo ke'echod. He was careful, let us say, to make sure that his hand wouldn't enter first. He extended his body, we'll say, to enter first. The tumo bia bahadi adodi kasyan. In such a case where he's making sure that his body and his arms enter all at the same time, so both set upon him simultaneously. As the Gemara goes on, though, we're going to be focusing on what is happening in, we'll say, slow motion or stop motion photography in a very detailed fashion. The Gemara asks, even the case Rabbi Ozer is describing, where he clasps his hands to his side, but even in that case, the person walks in a statue-like posture. Is it not so, though, that his nose protrudes ahead of his body, extends forth from his face? Is it not so that his nose enters first, and the tumah sets upon him, the tumah sets upon him, and he has not yet entered to be a violation of lo yavo? So the two offenses are not simultaneous. Elo Omar Rava. Rava presents his distinction. Hichnis yado mishum tumo iko mishum bioleka. Hichnis gufo tumo ubia bahadi hadodi koasyon. Now, just by translating the Gemara, you're not going to really make sense of it, because he seems to be saying the same thing that Rabbi Ozer said. But Tosfos explains that Hichnes Gufo is a case where he bent his head, he tilted his head backwards outside the house, so that you don't have the nose entering first. So Rava said that if your hand is extended and enters before the rest of you enter, so then they're not simultaneous. You have tumah, but you don't have bia, you don't have entrance yet. However, if you tilt your head back and enter that way, so then you'll have both your defilement and entrance simultaneous. Question. When you're walking into the house, even with your head tilted back, is it not so that your toe enters before the rest of you as you're walking in? And if that be the case, so then the tumah is affecting you before you've entered. So you don't have the advantage of saying simultaneous entry or simultaneous offense in order to explain how you can be in violation of both. Ela Omar Rav Papa. So Rav Papa has a new approach. How can we explain both offenses happening simultaneously? The offense of defilement and entrance to a room where there is a corpse. We can note ahead of time that Rav Papa and Mar Baravashi will give answers that remain, that are not challenged. So Rav Papa's scenario is Kigon she nifnos b'shida tevu migdal. He entered a room while contained within an enclosure, within a box or a chest. He was totally enclosed. That enclosure, which is referred to either shida, tevo, with different forms of closets or boxes that were brought into a room where there was a corpse. He's at that point not defiled because of his containment. And someone came along, and Tosfos adds, and this guy helped as well, removing the box wall, the box covering. Now, if you remove the box covering while in the room where there is a corpse, so the tuma ubia bahadi adodi kasyon, the defilement and his entrance, so to speak, are happening simultaneously, because that's his first entrance into this defiled environment. While he was contained in the box, he was not considered in the same domain as the corpse. But with the removal of the box top, he is now considered having entered the domain of the corpse, because the same overshadow that covers him is also covering the corpse, namely the ceiling of the room. Marbar of Ashi Yomar Kegon, his example of simultaneous tumah, to go to Ayel Kshugoises. The Nazir entered the room while the party was in the throes of death. Goses. He wasn't actually dead yet, but he was in the throes of death. So his entrance into the room doesn't represent any form of defilement. And there's also no offense in his having entered the room while the person was still technically alive. And while the Nazir was in the room, this guy dies. The tumo bia bahadi hadodi ka'asyon. There the defilement and entrance are said to be simultaneous. And in a case like that, the two offenses would apply. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.